The person you love cried loudly last night. What caused it will shock you. Do not scroll away from this yet, because what happened last night was not a small emotional moment. In this fictional story, the person you love did not simply become sad, wipe away a few tears, and move on. Something broke open inside them so suddenly that they could no longer hide what they had been carrying. They cried loudly. The kind of crying that comes when someone has spent too long pretending they are okay. The kind that makes breathing difficult. The kind that does not ask permission before every buried feeling comes rushing to the surface at once. And before you assume this happened because of an ex, because of some argument, or because something terrible happened around them, stay here. Because the real reason had something to do with you, but not in the way you might fear. What caused those tears was a realization. A realization about what they had done, what they had avoided, and what they may now be in danger of losing. And the moment that realization entered their mind, something inside them collapsed. They had been strong for too long. Controlled for too long. Careful for too long. Last night, control finally stopped working. It started quietly. They were alone. Maybe the room was dark except for the light from their phone. Maybe music was playing softly in the background. Maybe they had just finished another ordinary day and expected another ordinary night. Nothing around them suggested they were about to become emotional. But then something small happened. A memory appeared. Your name. Your photo. An old message. Something you once said that they had not fully understood at the time. And suddenly their attention stopped moving. They stared at the screen longer than they intended. There was something about seeing your words again after everything that had happened between you that made them feel different. Maybe you had written, "I hope you know I really did care." Maybe it was something simpler. Take care of yourself. Maybe nothing about the message seemed dramatic when you originally sent it. But last night, those words felt like goodbye. Not necessarily because you had left. Because the person you love suddenly realized how easily you could. That was the first crack. They put the phone down, but your words remained in their mind. They tried distracting themselves. They walked around. Got water. Turned on something to watch. Checked another app. Anything to stop the thoughts from becoming too deep. But once emotion has been avoided for too long, distraction eventually loses its power. Your face kept returning. And with it came memories they had pushed into the background. The moments when you tried to understand them. The times you stayed patient even when their behavior was confusing. The times you gave them space instead of forcing answers. The moments you showed care in small ways they had treated as ordinary. And then another thought arrived. What if they had taken all of that for granted? That question made them uncomfortable immediately. Because deep down, they knew the answer. Not intentionally. They never woke up and decided your patience did not matter. They never wanted to hurt you. But they had become used to something dangerous. Your presence. They got used to believing you would answer. Used to believing another conversation would come. Used to believing there would be another opportunity to explain themselves. Used to believing you understood what they meant even when they did not say it. And perhaps most dangerously, they became used to believing you would continue seeing the best in them no matter how long they remained emotionally uncertain. But last night, something made that assumption disappear. Maybe they saw something you posted. Maybe someone casually mentioned that you seemed different lately. Maybe they reread an older conversation and noticed how much warmer you had been then compared to now. Whatever triggered it, the realization arrived suddenly. You were no longer waiting in the same way. That thought stopped them completely. And this is where the tears began. Not loudly at first. One tear. Then another. The kind someone wipes away quickly while telling themselves, "This is ridiculous." But emotion does not care whether you think it is reasonable. They tried to stop. They could not. Because underneath the fear of losing you was something even heavier. Regret. They remembered a particular night. A night when you tried to get closer emotionally. Maybe you asked a simple question, "Can I ask you something honestly?" They knew from your tone that the conversation mattered. And instead of opening up, they became uncomfortable. They gave you a half answer. Maybe changed the subject. Maybe said they were tired. Maybe promised you would talk later. Later never came. At the time, it seemed small. Last night, it felt enormous. Because they suddenly imagined what that moment looked like from your side. You gathering courage. You choosing honesty. You opening a vulnerable part of yourself. And them quietly shutting the door because they were scared of where the conversation might lead. The person you love covered their face. That was when the crying became louder. Not because of one mistake. Because they could suddenly see a pattern. Every time you stepped closer, they became afraid. Every time the connection felt real, they needed distance. Every time you offered emotional clarity, they answered with uncertainty. And every time you remained patient, they told themselves patience meant there was more time. Now they realized patience might have been something you were offering at a cost. Your cost. Stay with me, because the next realization is what turns sadness into something much more intense. They started thinking about how often you may have questioned yourself because of them. Maybe you wondered if you were too emotional. Too interested. Too available. Maybe you wondered if you had misunderstood the connection entirely. Maybe there were nights when you reread conversations looking for signs that their feelings were real. And all the while, the person you love knew inside themselves that you mattered. They knew. That is the part that hurt them. They knew, but they did not show it clearly enough. And hidden love can feel exactly like no love to someone who is being asked to guess. They whispered something aloud into the empty room. I made them think they didn't matter. Hearing their own voice say it changed something. Their chest tightened. They cried harder. Because the person you love had spent so much time defending their intentions that they had barely considered your experience. Their intention was never to make you feel unimportant. But your heart never had access to their intention. It only had access to what they did. The delayed responses. The distance. The conversations avoided. The warmth followed by withdrawal. The uncertainty. And last night they finally understood a truth they had not wanted to face. Someone can hurt you without wanting to hurt you. Good intentions do not automatically create good experiences. That realization broke through every excuse they had been using. They could no longer tell themselves, "But I cared." Of course they cared. That was not the question. The question became, did they care in a way you could actually feel? And they did not like the answer. If you're drawn into this emotional fictional story, stay close and subscribe, because what happens next is the moment they discover something about you they were never expecting. The crying was not only about regret. It became panic when they realized you may have already made a decision without telling them. They picked up their phone again. Your conversation was still open. This time, they did not only look at your old messages. They looked at the recent ones. And suddenly, the difference became obvious. You were still kind. Still respectful. Still you. But something had changed. You no longer extended every conversation. You did not ask as many follow-up questions. You stopped checking whether they were okay every time their energy shifted. Maybe you replied warmly but did not linger. Maybe you stopped giving them opportunities to explain themselves when they clearly chose not to. At first, they had assumed you were busy. Now they saw something else. You had stopped carrying the emotional weight for both of you. That realization frightened them. Because it did not look like anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger means someone is still emotionally fighting. This looked like acceptance. The person you love suddenly wondered. What if you had accepted that they were never going to give you what you needed? They sat completely still. Then they scrolled farther. There was a message from several weeks earlier that they had almost forgotten. You had said something like, "I'm learning not to force what isn't meeting me halfway." They remembered reading it at the time. They thought it was a general comment. Maybe about life. Maybe work. Maybe another situation. But last night, for the first time, they wondered whether you had been talking about them. Their stomach dropped. They read the message again. And again. The room became painfully quiet. They started remembering what happened around that period. You had been more emotionally open before that. Then suddenly, you became calmer. Not cold. Calmer. They had mistaken your calmness for comfort. But what if your calmness came from a decision? What if you had finally stopped fighting reality? What if you had said to yourself, "I can love someone and still stop chasing clarity from them"? That possibility sent panic through them. They opened the text box. Typed, "Are you okay?" Deleted it. Too casual. Typed, "Have I done something?" Deleted. They knew the answer. Typed, "I need to talk to you." Deleted again. Too demanding. They were doing it again. Turning truth into vague language because vulnerability scared them. And seeing themselves repeat the pattern while they were literally crying over the consequences made something snap. They threw the phone onto the bed. Covered their face. And finally said what they had never said clearly enough. "I love them." Out loud. Not silently. Not safely inside their own thoughts. Out loud. And hearing those words made them cry even harder. Because now another truth followed immediately. If they loved you, why had they spent so much time behaving as though losing you would not destroy them? Why did pride matter more than communication? Why did fear receive more loyalty than love? Why had they kept waiting for certainty from you before offering honesty from themselves? These questions came faster than answers. But one question hurt more than all the others. What if they had realized too late? That was when they started panicking. They picked up the phone again. Your profile. Your messages. They almost called. Their finger hovered over the button. But they hesitated because it was late. What if you were asleep? What if you saw their name and chose not to answer? What if you answered and they froze? They had spent months imagining a perfect confession. Now none of those rehearsed words seemed useful. They did not want to perform. They wanted to tell the truth. So instead of calling, they began typing. I don't know if you're awake. They paused. Then continued. I also don't know if I have the right to suddenly say all of this after being so quiet. Their eyes filled again. But I realized something tonight. They stopped. What had they realized? That they loved you? Yes. But there was more. They realized the thing they feared most was no longer vulnerability. It was regret. So they typed. I've been protecting myself from saying too much, and I think I ended up making you believe there wasn't much to say. That sentence felt painfully accurate. They continued. There was another pause. There still is. Their thumb hovered over the send button. They could barely breathe. They had never sent something this honest to you. And then another thought entered their mind. What if this message was selfish? What if they were only reaching out now because they sensed you pulling away? What if they dumped their fear into your heart and expected you to fix it? That possibility stopped them. For several minutes, they just sat there. Crying more quietly now. Thinking. And for the first time, they separated two things they had always confused. Telling you the truth. And asking you to rescue them from the consequences of waiting. Those were not the same. They could tell you the truth without demanding that you immediately return. They could say they loved you without asking you to erase every hurt. They could apologize without expecting instant forgiveness. They could finally be honest and still respect whatever you chose to do with that honesty. That understanding calmed them slightly. So they added one final line. I'm not telling you this because I expect anything from you tonight. I just don't want my fear to keep speaking for me. Then they pressed send. The message disappeared. Delivered. The person you love stared at the screen. Their crying stopped almost immediately, not because the pain vanished, but because fear changed form. Now they were waiting. And waiting after honesty felt completely different from waiting before it. Before, silence had protected them. Now silence exposed them. Seconds passed. No response. A minute. Nothing. They stood up and walked around the room. checked the phone. Nothing. Another minute. Still nothing. Their mind began creating every possible explanation. You were asleep. You were busy. Your phone was away. You saw the message and did not know what to say. Or worse. You saw it and felt nothing. That last possibility almost sent them back into tears. But they stopped themselves. They remembered something important. If they were finally going to love you differently, they had to give you freedom too. Honesty did not create an obligation. You were allowed to need time. They put the phone down. Sat on the edge of the bed. And waited. Then the screen lit up. Your name. Their heart jumped. They grabbed the phone immediately. Your message was short. Very short. What happened? That was all. The person you love stared at the question. You knew something must have happened because they never spoke like this. You were right. Everything had happened. Months of emotion had happened in one night. They began typing. I finally understood what I've been doing. You responded. What do you mean? They breathed deeply. Then wrote. I think I've been pulling away every time I start feeling too much. You read it. Your typing indicator appeared. Then stopped. Then appeared again. Your eventual answer was. I know. 2 words. The person you love froze. You knew? You had known this whole time? They replied immediately. You knew? Yes. Their chest tightened. Then why didn't you say anything? There was a pause. Your answer came. I did. They stared at the screen. And suddenly they remembered. Of course you had. Not in those exact words. But you had asked. More than once. Why do you get distant after we get close? Did I do something? Are you sure everything is okay? You can just tell me if you need space. You had said it. They simply never gave you enough truth to continue the conversation. The person you love covered their mouth with one hand. More tears came. But these tears felt different. Because now they understood that you had not failed to notice them. They had failed to answer you. They typed. You're right. Then. I'm sorry. Your response did not come immediately. Finally. I'm not angry. That should have comforted them. Instead, it frightened them. Because again, anger might have been easier than what came next. You wrote. I think I just stopped expecting you to explain. Their heart broke at those words. Stopped expecting. Not stopped caring. Stopped expecting. There is a difference. And that difference told them everything. You had adapted to their silence. You had lowered expectations to protect your heart. And the person you love suddenly realized that emotional distance does not always begin when someone stops loving you. Sometimes it begins when they stop expecting anything from you. That was what made them cry again. They typed. I don't want you to expect nothing from me. Your answer came quickly. Then what am I supposed to expect? There it was. The question. The moment. You were finally giving them the chance to define something they had avoided defining for far too long. Their fingers hovered over the keyboard. They could say they cared. Too safe. They could say they missed you. True, but incomplete. They could say they wanted to try. Still not enough. The truth was already sitting inside them. They had said it aloud in the room minutes earlier. Now they had to decide whether they could say it to the only person who actually needed to hear it. They typed, "I love you." They stared. Their breathing became shallow again. Then they pressed send. Delivered. Silence. The longest silence of the entire night. Your typing indicator did not appear. The person you love began regretting everything. Maybe too much. Too late. Too sudden. Maybe they should have explained more first. But the words were already there. And then you replied. "I don't know what to say." Their heart sank. They wrote. "You don't have to say anything." That was important. They meant it. You did not owe them an immediate answer. Then your next message arrived. Part of me has wanted to hear that for a long time. Hope rushed through them. But before they could respond, another message appeared. But something changed. Their entire body went still. What changed? They asked. You did not answer immediately. When you finally did, your response caused the person you loved to stop crying completely. Because what you revealed was not that you had stopped loving them. It was something more complicated. Something they never expected. You had recently been offered a chance to change your life. A new beginning. A decision you had not told them about. And the reason you had kept it private was directly connected to the way they had been treating you. You wrote. I realized I was planning my life around someone who had never asked to be part of it. The person you love stared at those words. Their stomach dropped. There it was. The consequence. Not punishment. Not revenge. Life moving forward. While they were waiting for courage, you had started building a future that did not require their certainty. They typed. Are you leaving? Your reply came after a long pause. Maybe. Their hearts started racing again. When? Another pause. Soon. That word changed everything. Soon. Suddenly their emotional breakdown had a new meaning. They were not only grieving what they had done. They were staring at the possibility that the clock had already begun moving. And now they had a choice. They could panic. Beg. Promise everything. Ask you to stay. Or they could finally prove that their love was about more than their fear of losing you. They typed. I don't want you to give something up because I finally found the courage to talk. You did not reply immediately. Then. I didn't expect you to say that. They wrote. I want you here. I'm terrified of you leaving. But I don't want my fear to become your cage. You came back because you knew there was one more piece. One specific moment. One memory your soulmate had not yet connected to your decision to leave. And when you finally told them what happened that day, they did not respond immediately. They just stared at the screen, reading your words again and again, because suddenly the night of tears made complete sense. You wrote, "It was the day I finally stopped waiting for you to choose clarity." That sentence alone was enough to make their chest tighten. But you were not finished. You continued. You probably remember it as a normal conversation. I don't. Your soulmate's mind began searching through memories again. A normal conversation. Which one? There had been so many. And then you reminded them. You had reached out that day because something important had happened in your life. Something you were excited about. Something you wanted to share with the person who mattered to you. You had imagined telling them and seeing their reaction. Maybe you wanted encouragement. Maybe you wanted to hear their voice. Maybe you simply wanted to feel that your happiness had somewhere safe to land. And when you reached out, they responded. At first, everything seemed fine. You told them the news. They congratulated you. They said the right things. But then you added one vulnerable sentence. Something simple. I wish you were here. That was it. 4 words. You were not demanding anything. You were not asking them to drop everything. You were simply telling the truth. You wished they were there. And your soulmate remembered what happened next. They froze. They read those words and felt the connection become real again. Too real. That sentence did not feel casual. It carried intimacy. It carried possibility. It carried the suggestion that maybe you wanted them inside your life, not just somewhere around the edges of it. And instead of answering honestly, your soulmate did what they had always done when emotion became uncomfortable. They changed the subject. They wrote something light. Something like, "You'll be fine, enjoy your night." Maybe they added a smile. Maybe they tried to make it sound supportive. But they never answered what you actually said. They never said, "I wish I were there too." They never acknowledged the vulnerability. They left your 4 words hanging in the conversation as if they had not noticed what they meant. And in this fictional story, that was the moment something inside you quietly changed. Your soulmate read your message explaining this and felt their throat tighten. They remembered now. Perfectly. They remembered staring at your words. They remembered wanting to say it back. They remembered typing, "I wish I was there too." And then deleting it. They had deleted the exact sentence you needed to hear. Why? Fear. Again. They were afraid that saying it would reveal too much. Afraid it would make the connection more serious. Afraid you would expect something they were not ready to define. So they chose safety. Their safety. And you received silence where honesty had been. You wrote, "That night, I realized I was tired of offering pieces of myself and pretending it didn't hurt when you stepped around them." Your soulmate covered their face. The tears returned. Not as loudly as before, but deeper now. Because this time, they remembered the exact moment they had hurt you. Not through cruelty. Not through rejection. Through avoidance. And avoidance can be cruel even when the person avoiding does not mean it to be. They typed, "I remember." You replied, "Do you remember what you almost said?" That question stopped them. How could you know? They had never sent the message. They wrote, "What do you mean?" You replied, "You were typing for a long time." Their heart sank. Of course. You had seen the typing indicator. You watched it appear. Disappear. Appear again. Then nothing. You did not know what words had been written and erased, but you knew something had almost been said. Your soulmate typed, "I wrote that I wished I was there too." There was a long silence. Then you responded. "I knew it." 3 words. And somehow those 3 words hurt more than anything else. You knew. You had felt the truth underneath their fear. But feelings hidden underneath fear were no longer enough for you. Your soulmate replied, "Why didn't you ask me?" Your answer came immediately. Because I was tired of asking people to say the things they already chose not to say. That sentence went through them like a blade. Not because you were punishing them. Because you were describing something much older than this connection. Something from your past. Maybe this was the real hidden piece. The part of your history that had shaped everything about the way you responded to emotional inconsistency. You continued. "I spent too much of my life trying to pull honesty out of people." Your soulmate stopped crying and started reading carefully. You wrote, "I used to believe if I asked the right question, stayed patient enough, explained myself clearly enough, loved someone gently enough, eventually they would give me the truth." Another message. Sometimes they did. Another pause. Usually after I had already exhausted myself trying to get it. Your soulmate felt something uncomfortable growing inside them. Recognition. Because without realizing it, they had placed you in that old position again. Waiting. Interpreting. Trying to create safety for someone who would not create it for themselves. You wrote, "So that night, when I said I wished you were there and you avoided it, I made a promise to myself." Their heart raced. "What promise?" they asked. Your response came. That I would never again beg someone to meet me in a moment they clearly knew mattered. Silence. Your soulmate reread the sentence. Then again. And suddenly they understood why your energy changed after that day. You did not become cold. You became disciplined. You stopped reaching into the empty space after them. You stopped trying to rescue every conversation. You stopped interpreting every silence generously. You began letting their actions speak without translating them into something kinder. And when an opportunity appeared that could move your life forward, you accepted it. Not because you stopped caring. Because you stopped making your future depend on someone else's emotional readiness. That was what caused the breakdown last night. Your soulmate had finally realized that the moment they thought was small had become a turning point in your life. They had not rejected you dramatically. They had simply failed to meet you when you stepped forward. And sometimes that is enough to teach someone to stop stepping forward. Your soulmate typed, "I'm so sorry." You replied, "I know." Then another message. "But I need you to understand something." What? I'm not telling you this so you spend the night hating yourself. Your soulmate stared at that. You knew them well enough to know exactly where their mind was going. Guilt. Self-blame. The urge to turn regret into punishment. You continued. If you make this about how terrible you feel, then I end up comforting you for something that hurt me. That sentence stopped them completely. Because you were right. And maybe in the past, that was another pattern they had carried. Whenever they realized they hurt someone, they became so overwhelmed by guilt that the injured person ended up reassuring them. But accountability was not supposed to work that way. So your soulmate took a breath. They did not send another dramatic apology. They did not say, "I'm the worst." They did not ask you to tell them they were still a good person. Instead, they wrote, "Thank you for telling me. I understand why that moment mattered now. Then. I wish I had handled it differently. And finally. I can't change that night. I can only make sure I don't keep doing the same thing." Your reply came. "That's all I can ask." Something shifted there. Not forgiveness of everything. Not instant repair. But a different kind of space opened between you. A space where regret could become information instead of punishment. Your soulmate sat quietly for several minutes. Then they asked the question that had been sitting in their chest since learning you might leave. "Do you still want me in your life?" That was not the same as, "Do you love me?" It was more practical. More vulnerable. Because you can love someone and still decide they do not belong in your next chapter. Your answer did not come quickly. And your soulmate did not rush you. Eventually you wrote, "Yes." Their heart lifted. But then. Not the way things were. They nodded even though you could not see them. They understood. What would have to change, they asked. You replied, "I don't need you to become someone else." Then. "I need to stop feeling like every honest moment between us is something you regret afterward." That sentence made everything clear. It was not about constant attention. Not about perfect communication. You did not need them to answer every message immediately. You did not need grand gestures. You needed emotional continuity. If the connection became vulnerable on Monday, you needed to know they would not pretend it never happened on Tuesday. If they said something meaningful at night, you needed them to still stand behind it in daylight. That was the wound. Not silence alone. The emotional whiplash. The feeling of being invited close and then treated like closeness had been a mistake. Your soulmate remembered dozens of moments when they had done exactly that. Not intentionally. But repeatedly. They typed, "I think I understand." You replied, "Tell me what you understand." That question forced them to put it into words. They wrote, "You don't need constant reassurance." Pause. "You need to know that if I open the door, I'm not going to punish you for walking through it." Your response came almost immediately. Yes. One word. But your soulmate felt like they had finally understood something they had been missing for months. They continued. "And if I get scared after we get close, I need to tell you I'm scared instead of acting like the closeness didn't matter. Yes. Another simple answer. There it was. The map. Not complicated. Just difficult. If fear came, name it. If distance was needed, explain it. If feelings changed, tell the truth. Stop making silence carry messages it was never designed to carry. If you're staying with this fictional emotional story, keep close, because this is where last night stops being only about tears and becomes a real turning point. Your soulmate is about to make a decision, but the decision is not to beg you to stay. It is something much harder. They asked you, "When are you leaving?" You sent the date. And when they saw it, their body went still. Much sooner than they thought. Not months. Days. A small number of days suddenly separated the life you knew from whatever was coming next. The panic returned immediately. They imagined all the time they had lost. Months of waiting. Now days. Their first instinct was to ask to see you immediately. Every day if possible. Make up for everything. But then they stopped. Panic was speaking again. And they had promised themselves they would begin noticing when fear tried to take control. So instead of demanding your time, they asked, "Would you be comfortable seeing me before you go?" You took a while. Then, yes. Their heart jumped. Really? Yes. But I don't want some huge goodbye scene. They smiled sadly. Neither do I. That was not completely true. Part of them wanted a huge moment. A movie moment. Something that could somehow erase months of hesitation in one perfect evening. But reality was teaching them something important. You cannot repair a pattern with one dramatic gesture. The most romantic moment in the world means little if behavior returns to normal afterward. So instead, they wanted a conversation. Real. Ordinary. Uncomfortable if necessary. You agreed to meet. The days leading up to it felt strange. Your soulmate made a deliberate choice. They did not flood you with messages. They did not suddenly become overwhelmingly affectionate in a way that would feel like panic. Instead, they practiced something they had struggled with before. Consistency. The next morning, they messaged. "Good morning. I hope today goes well. Nothing huge." You answered later. The following evening, they asked about something you had mentioned. And when the conversation became slightly vulnerable, they did not vanish. That mattered. You noticed. You did not praise them for basic communication. You simply noticed. And maybe that was healthier too. Your soulmate was not supposed to perform change for applause. Change had to become behavior even when nobody congratulated them. One night before your meeting, they felt panic rise again. They imagined you leaving. Imagined you meeting new people. Imagined someone else appreciating the things they had taken too long to appreciate. Jealousy appeared. Fear. Old instinct said disappear. Protect yourself before attachment becomes stronger. They almost stopped replying. Then they caught it. They looked at your conversation and typed, "I'm having a weird moment." You replied, "What kind?" They hesitated. Then, "I'm thinking about you leaving, and part of me wants to emotionally pull away before it happens." You took a moment. Then wrote, "Thank you for telling me instead." Your soulmate stared at those words. That was it. The pattern was already changing in a tiny way. The fear had not disappeared. But instead of turning fear into distance, they turned it into information. You responded, "I'm scared too." That surprised them. "Of leaving?" You wrote, "Of leaving after we finally started talking honestly." There it was. You were not fearless either. The person you love had been so consumed by their own panic that they forgot you were carrying emotions too. You could be excited about the opportunity and still sad about the connection. You could choose yourself and still wish timing were different. You could want to leave and want them at the same time. Human emotion rarely chooses only one truth. Your soulmate wrote, "I don't want you to feel guilty for being excited." You replied, "I don't." Then, after a pause, "But I appreciate you saying that." Another small moment. Another brick. The meeting day finally arrived. Your soulmate reached the place early. Very early. They were nervous enough to consider leaving before you arrived. Not because they did not want to see you. Because reality was more frightening than messaging. Behind a screen, they could pause. Edit. Think. Face to face, you would see everything. The nerves. The regret. The love. The fear. But they stayed. And when you arrived, their entire expression changed. You saw it. You had always been good at seeing it. They stood up. For a moment neither of you knew what to do. Hug? Wave? Pretend things were normal? Eventually you smiled softly. They smiled back. The awkwardness broke a little. You sat down. At first, conversation was ordinary. Travel plans. Your opportunity. What you still had to organize. People you had not told yet. Your soulmate listened carefully. And something happened that surprised you. They did not constantly turn the conversation back toward themselves. They did not make your leaving about their pain. They asked about what excited you. What you hoped to learn. What you were afraid of. What you wanted this new chapter to give you. And you slowly relaxed. Because for once, their fear was present without dominating the room. Eventually you said, "You're being different." They smiled nervously. Good different or concerning different? You laughed. Good, I think. They nodded. I'm trying. That was honest. Not, I've changed. Trying. They looked at you for a long moment. Then said, I owe you something. You immediately looked cautious. What? An answer. They knew exactly which answer. You did too. The answer they had deleted months ago. Your soulmate looked directly at you. When you told me you wished I was there. Your expression changed. They continued. I did too. Silence. I typed it. I know, you said. They smiled sadly. And then I deleted it because I was scared that saying it would make everything too real. You looked down. They continued. I wish I could go back and send it. Then they stopped. No. Actually, that's not true. You looked up. What? I wish I could go back and be someone who didn't delete it. That sentence landed differently. Because they understood the problem was bigger than one message. It was who they had been inside vulnerable moments. They continued. I can't change that version of me. But I can stop letting that version decide everything.